All right, friends, we're going to continue what we were talking about last week. Yeah.
Order in the court.
So let's refresh your memory. We're talking about.
He thinks it's Kriyasator.
That you're supposed to speak. Yeah. We're talking about the prohibition of eating the new grain. So let me remind you what it's all about. So when the temple stood, we'll soon address that is applied nowadays or not. We'll get to that once we understand the law first, the basic law. So the basic law is that the Torah prohibits to eat the new grain until a specific offering is offered on behalf of the entire population. A quart of grain. Now this grain was harvested, the Torah says like this. When is it offered? The day following the first day of Pesach. In Israel, where there's one day, that means the first day of Chol HaMoed. It was cut the night before. After Yom Tov, they went to a field nearby Jerusalem, where they cut the specific measure of grain required, this quart, that's it, required to be offered the next day. How was it offered? It was the grains were winnowed and so on, and then toasted, and then waved in all 6 directions before God, before the altar, and then distributed amongst the Kohanim to eat as representatives of God. So this is a thank you. In other words, now the harvest season is just beginning. Barley is the first of the 5 grains to ripen. It's 5 grains we're talking about from which this offering could be brought. It's brought from barley, but it could be... Actually, no, the oral law specifies it has to be barley. What I meant to say was that the offering of the barley allows for the consumption of all the 5 grains that constitute chometz, or for that matter, constitute matzah. Matzah has to be made from grain that could become chometz. So it's 5, and those 5 grains are wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. So no one may eat of the new grain, these specific, everything doesn't affect anything else, but these grains, until this offering is brought. So last week we explained, what does it mean? It means that in order, you have some grain in front of you, can I eat this or not? Temple times. The question is, was this around that exists in the world when they offered the offering on the second day of Pesach? If it was around when that was offered, then this was accounted for and thanked for. Now, what does it mean, was it around? What's the definition of around? Did it at least take root for several weeks before the offering was brought? Now, factually speaking, as we explained last week, many grains are sown later on, going forward throughout the rest of what we're in now, in spring and the summer. They're planted and harvested and stored in the silo. No one can touch it till next year Pesach. So now this offering is allowing for all the grain, essentially, that was stored away and harvested throughout the previous summer. It's not that simple. There are winter growths as well, especially in Israel, whatever, but that's the bottom line. Simply, can I eat this? Was it thanked for? And if it was around, existed minimally as having been taken root, not just planted, but taken root, at least 2 weeks before Pesach. So there was a lot of grain that was harvested, planted 2 weeks before Pesach. We're going to only eat it much later, but that's going to be okay to eat before next Pesach because it was around when the Omer offering was brought. So when it is duly harvested later, it's okay. Yes?
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you said last week it had to be taken root before Shavuot.
No, that's something else. We're not there yet.
We're getting to the next thing.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Listen, fine, we'll get to that now. That has to be, if I said that, has to be corrected on 2 accounts. We're not talking about this grain anyway. Okay. So now we're talking about the individual in Israel. When can he cannot eat his grain until this offering is brought. Now, right here, does this apply only to Israel? There's 3 questions. Does it apply to outside Israel? Does it apply when there's no temple? does it apply to grain belonging to a non-Jew? If you buy grain from a non-Jew, does it have to, the same restriction apply? Does it have to be around when they offer the offering? So these are all a matter of discussion amongst the codifiers. The basic ruling is yes to all three. At the end of the day, do you want to be strict? Yes to all three. So it applies, therefore, nowadays, to any grain that you buy anywhere. You'd have to be certain that the grain was around, because there's no offering, but the Torah says, on this very day, when you bring the Omer offering, from henceforth, you can eat of the new grain. So the Torah says it's not just the offering, it's the day that gives the permissibility. So in the absence of an offering, there is still, of course, the day. Mind you, for us, the day is the next day in the diaspora, because we have 2 days. So we have to wait an extra. For those that observe this, we'll wait an extra day. The grain, before you can eat of the new grain, that's sitting in the whatever in the silos that you're buying, you'd have to wait till the 17th of Nisan, because we have the first day of Al Chalamoid, in other words. Be it as it may. So here's the fact: most Jews, I'm talking about observant, and the Hasidic world is not particular about the prohibition of Chadash. We are not. And there's several reasons. First of all, because there's the assumption that most grains anyway have been around for the first day of Pesach from previously, imported or whatever. Grain, sits, cut and serve to you. Secondly, there is an opinion that says it doesn't apply to non-Jewish grain. So the grain that we're getting, unless the farmer is Jewish, but you can assume most are not, so the whole law doesn't apply because you're buying the grain from a non-Jew. And that is the custom in Chabad that we're not particular, and the whole Hasidic world is. It's actually interesting because Chabad and the Hasidic world in general go above and beyond all the observances of all the laws. We have 2 pairs of tefillin, our talis, our tzitzis has detail that nobody else has. In everything, it's almost every mitzvah. When it comes to this, whatever reason, we are not. I don't know why exactly, but that's the reason. But I will tell you this, that the authority that says, is of the opinion that it doesn't apply to non-Jewish grain, which is most of the grain that we eat, if not all of it. And by the way, buying baked goods made in Israel is also not a problem because it's all planted before Pesach. Everything, all the grains are planted before Pesach, are sown and have taken root. So the only question is really in the diaspora, and that's anyway, probably was also before, maybe later. And even if it is, as I just told you, it is what? Even if it is planted later, it's no problem because it is in the diaspora.
Non-Jewish?
Non-Jewish.
Nothing to do with the Shemitah, obviously.
No. Because it belongs to a non-Jew. So I'm telling you, who is the authority that advances this position, that it belongs to a non-Jew, law doesn't apply? His name is Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, known as the Bach, not the composer. Bach stands for Bayit Chadash, new house. That's the title of his work, and it's a famous commentary on the code of Jewish law. He's the one that advances this permissibility, this leniency, this justification for not being concerned in the diaspora, old grain, new grain, because it comes from non-Jews. Who was the Bach? So the Baal Shem Tov said about the Bach, who lived before him, that when he died and his soul went up to heaven, they cooled, this is metaphoric, but they cooled the fires of purgatory for 60 days. Everybody got a huge reprieve because this great soul came up on high, which tells you what a great soul he was. And he's the one that says there's a leniency, we can find a justification for why people are not concerned because it's bought from non-Jews, and he advances the position that it does not apply to non-Jews, non-Jewish grain. Clear? That's number one. We just addressed nowadays. Go on.
Are there those you say that Chabad and other Hasidic don't?
Right, so there are those that do it, the Lithuanian world, they call themselves. So you'll see In bakeries, I think probably here, I don't know. Cheskis, you may have a sign that says, we only sell Yoshon old grain, not Chadash.
So if one buys Israeli products.
That's not a problem. That's
strictly,
anyway
then-
Yoshon. It's
So
if it's
instead-
made here. If it's made here, and those are particular, will only make it. And there's a mashgiach, and they have to research and so on. You pay, it costs a little extra like anything for this research and hashgacha and what's the word, and assertion. What's not assertion, and certification that the grain is. Yeah. So there are such bakeries that put a sign in the window or all their products. It's becoming more popular nowadays a little bit.
Just explain the non-Jewish part. Why is that? No, I don't understand that.
Because the Torah says your grain.
That's the answer. Your grain has to be. So if it's not your grain,
It's not your grain. You bought it from somebody else. The whole thing doesn't apply. That's what the Bach advances.
That's what I want.
Okay,
Kosher quality, they also only kebach yashan.
they do. It's possible. I don't know.
They don't sell Chadash.
Oh, they do. That could be. So even kosher quality. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Homemade too, the same thing.
Yeah. Okay.
You'll see it on all the packages.
Another question? That's what I said. Okay. So that's one prohibition, which we discussed its current application, or not. But then there's a second prohibition that doesn't apply nowadays, because that is only with respect to the temple. Okay, and that is that private consumption of the grain becomes permissible after the offering of what? The Omer. Now, 7 weeks later, on the same day, the Torah says you count 7 weeks. And there'll be another holiday called Shavuos, the Festival of Weeks. And that's a Yom Tov. And there's a special offering that's brought then, in addition to festive offerings, a special offering of 2 loaves of wheat bread together with 2 yearling sheep. Also a way of offering. Literally, there's these 2 big loaves of bread, 2 sheep. The Kohen would scoop them up like this and wave them. The sheep will be offered, the bread eaten. It's called the Shtei Halechem, the 2 breads. The Torah says that this is your first offering of the new grain. Which means that even though the first day of Pesach came and allowed for grain that exists to be used for private consumption, you cannot use that grain for an offering. And grain was a big part of offering. They're called meal offerings in English, mincha in Hebrew, which means literally a gift. You have to wait till Shavuos. So there's a 7-week delay for the allowance of the new crop to be brought as an offering. The same rule applies. It has to take root before Pesach. It's got to take root before 2 weeks before Pesach, and certainly grain that's sitting in your silo for the whole summer. That first day of Pesach, it's okay. You have to wait. When I use that, all the grain, you have to wait till Shavuot. Clear?
Public consumption.
Huh?
It means public.
It's a sacrificial consumption. It's called lagavah for God, for heaven.
Right, but that allowed the public. Well, what's the
No, the
difference?
public consumption was allowed after the first day of Pesach.
Well, okay.
For an
But
individual-
private and public then.
As an offering.
As an
If I'm
offering.
bringing an offering of this grain, that's what you just said there, right? As an offering, you have to wait till Shavuos. And for that matter, in the temple itself,
Just, okay.
any public meaning any communal, doesn't matter what the offering is. Any offering, if it's using the grain, which it often did, you'd have to wait till Shavuos. Clear? Now the law is, what if someone? We're repeating what we said last week. There's nothing new so far. Hopefully it's clearer. Yes. Now what if someone, he didn't know that the grain he did know, it doesn't matter if they didn't think it was significant, whatever, ignorance or whatever the case may be. He went, it's after the first day of Pesach, so private, you're allowed to eat. But he went and brought, he had to bring an offering. He was obligated to bring an offering, a sin offering, a guilt offering, a thanksgiving offering. He was obligated. And that offering includes grain. So he brought didn't wait till Shavuos. It's new grain, but the first day of Pesach, sitting in the farm from last summer, first day of Pesach came, no problem, everybody can now enjoy it. He's using that, didn't wait till Shavuos as his offering. So the law is you should wait till Shavuos. But after the fact, if you brought it, it's acceptable. And you don't have to bring an offering again. If it was an obligatory offering, you don't have to, it's not disqualified. You discharge your obligation. We have instances of this in thousands of cases in Jewish law, where in the first place it should be done like this. But if you did it like this, provided it conforms to certain basics, it's acceptable. The laws of mezuzah and tefillah and KOSHER, thousands of areas in Jewish law is this phenomenon of, in the first place, it should be like this. You should. But if you didn't, provided the minimum, this and this is in place, it's acceptable. Okay, so that's the law. Now we're going to explain to you, there's three opinions to explain this law. Which law? When I just said, what is it? Repeat it back to me. The law that I just said. That if that's what happened? Let's hear the scenario. What happened?
If you do anything that should be done in a particular...
That's in general. I'm asking this specific case. What's the case at point at hand?
You brought the offering, and it was of the new grain, and it should not. You should have waited.
Waited for what?
To offer that grain.
Waited for what?
For Shavuos.
For Shavuos. When did he bring it?
He brought it before.
How long before?
Any time before, after Pesach.
So he brought it between Pesach and
Shavuos.
Shavuos. So what's the law?
The law is that he should have waited until Shavuos, but he didn't. So the point is that he didn't and he should have, but he brought it anyway and it's okay.
Okay, so now we're going to explain why it's okay. There's three different views why it's okay. All right? View number one, advanced by the Rashba, is that the prohibition of the new grain is one prohibition. Don't touch the new grain, God says. And it's lifted in stages. It's lifted for general consumption on the first day of Pesach, and then completely lifted the restriction for use in the temple on Shavuos. It's one issa, one prohibition. And therefore, since the prohibition is already weakened significantly, once the offering is brought on the first day of Pesach, so that's the reason why if somebody brings it before Shavuos, it's not if he would bring it, not disqualified. If he would bring it before Pesach, nothing to talk about. Bring it again, meaningless, nothing happened. Didn't do anything. But if he brings it after Pesach, why is it acceptable after the fact? Because the prohibition, thou shalt not, has been weakened significantly by the fact that it was 50% lifted on the first day of Pesach. So the net result is a weaker prohibition, and a weaker prohibition therefore says you should, but if you didn't, okay. That's the first view. So repeat it back to me. What's the philosophical? It's kind of philosophical. What's the explanation behind this law? Answer. Repeat back what this position is.
Since you already brought after Pesach, the first offering, the weekend's potential for it to be a problem if you brought it before.
Right. So the key point, to hit the nail on the head here, there's two prohibitions here. He says they're one. That's the point. It's not two separate prohibitions. If there be two separate ones, then no is no. How do you justify it's still good after the fact? The second one, if it would be an independent, equal prohibition, a separate one. There's one that applies to private. There's one that applies to separate. To bringing the grain as an offering, then there's no reason, there's no exception here, no exception here. You may not eat it before Pesach. You may not bring it as an offering before Shavuos. Neither one would allow for, but after any loophole. Why is there a loophole? Because it's not two prohibitions. He explains, it's one. And since it's weakened by the offering of the Omer, if that's respected, the prohibition is softened, and a softened prohibition means it doesn't have the same force as a standard prohibition, and therefore it means that after the fact it is permissible. So the key Here is it's one prohibition. Because if it would be two, then it wouldn't work. That's the whole key to this, which has to be said. It's one prohibition that is now weakened. Therefore, after the fact, it's permissible. There's a second view that says, no, they're two separate prohibitions. So if they're two separate prohibitions, why is it that there is an allowance? What Torah says don't. When there's don't. He answers because to begin with, the second prohibition is not as strict. Why? Because it doesn't say don't. It doesn't say don't. It says the first offering should be of the new grain. The words, thou shalt not bring an offering of the new grain, it doesn't say until Shavuos. It doesn't frame it in the usual, you shouldn't. It frames it affirmatively. The new one should be Shavuos. So since it's a prohibition derived, not direct, but it's the flip side of the you should, or then you shouldn't. But since the you shouldn't is not spelled out like the first you shouldn't, do not eat, therefore to begin with, that it's separate. But the Torah mandated to begin with a weaker prohibition that allows for, if you didn't, it's still valid. So it's a different view altogether. Summary of the second view.
Whose view is that?
It's advanced by the I forgot his name. It's one of the later authorities. No? So, let's repeat that. What's the second view? Very different from the first.
It's two separate prohibitions.
So, the first one's not negotiable. Why is the second negotiable?
It's positive.
Because it was never framed, as a negative prohibition. It was never framed that way. So therefore, the Torah is clearly saying, this is what you should do, but if you didn't, it's still accepted. Clear? Key is two separate, but that's not enough. The second one is different than the first. Because the first says, you shall not. What does the second one say? When it comes to offering to the temple?
It's affirmative.
It just...
It's affirmative.
It just says the first one should be the two breads offered on Shavuos. So since the Torah doesn't phrase it like it does the standard, thou shalt not, that's the reason why even if you didn't provide it, the first prohibition was respected, then your offering is valid.
That principle applies to other future and
Huh?
Does that apply? That principle applies to other mitzvahs, obviously, because it said should and you don't, but you do something else. Clearly, same principle.
Same principle. When the Torah it phrases it not just positively, but also as a negative, you shouldn't. Then there's no after the fact.
Right.
There isn't. Okay.
So why is it not three issues? One, bringing the omer.
Yeah.
Two, not eating. And three, positively bringing the bread, the wheat on Shavuos.
Are you asking a question? I don't know the question.
Well, we say there are two aspects. One is bringing the omer on Pesach.
We're dealing here with, may I use the grain or not?
Right.
There's a prohibition in force here with respect to
Right.
private consumption and a prohibition with respect to bring it as an offering.
Okay, so my
Now
question is...
we're discussing these two prohibitions. There's the positive, bring the omer, eat the... We're not talking about that. We're talking about these two prohibitions. And now the second position says they're not the same. The first prohibition is said, thou shalt not. The second one is only derived. It just says you should bring it as a first offering. Hence, it's weaker. That's why, after the fact, it's kosher. That's what we're dealing with here. The nature of the restriction. Two different kinds of restriction. The first view says not. It's one restriction lifted in stages. Okay, now the third view. This is advanced by the Sfas Emes, the famous Rebbes of Ger. So he says like this, actually it's not a prohibition at all when it comes to Shavuos. It's not a prohibition. As we just said, it's not framed. So what is it? It's not a weaker prohibition, not a prohibition at all. And certainly doesn't, it's not part of the original prohibition about eating grain. It's something else entirely. The Torah is simply saying, they're not saying don't anything. Torah is saying your first offering should be from the grain. And it's not even, and therefore, don't bring an offering of the new grain till this offering is brought. There's not even a therefore. There's only one. There's no flip side, therefore not. It's only affirmative. Your first offering should be from the grain. So since the Torah never to begin with even implied a prohibition, so there's no prohibition. So your first offering shouldn't be brought now. You should bring it later. But if you brought it, it's kosher.
What does Sfas Emes say about the Omer offering then?
That's not negotiable. That's clearly a prohibition. That's a prohibition. The second one is not a prohibition. Here's the fascinating difference. What happens now if someone did brought it? He brought it. Now the question is, if somebody else comes with a new grain and says, before Shavuos, they don't know, or they're asking, they come to the Beis HaMikdash, they ask the Kohen, can I bring my offering from new grain? What's our answer to him? If someone already brought it already. The first two positions will say, of course not. The prohibition is not a strong one, still in force. Right? It's either weakened, first view, or to begin with, it's not such a strict prohibition, but if it's a prohibition. So if you're asking, of course you have to still respect it. Wait till after Shavuos. Yeah? That's the first two views, but that's not the response according to the third view. The third view would say, bring it, because no problem. Why?
Somebody already broke the ice.
Somebody broke the ice. The whole point is that Hashem says, I want the two breads to be your first offering. And if someone went and brought their offering and snuck it in willingly, wrongly, it doesn't matter how or what, no longer are those two breads going to be the first. There's no reason to restrict anybody else thereafter. If it was a prohibition of any kind, compromised or weak in the first place, then it's to be respected. Right? So if someone's asking and saying, yeah, I've got new grain. This guy brought it yesterday. And I'm his neighbor and I also harvested it, at the same time he did. And it wasn't around on the first, Shavuos hasn't come yet. Can I bring it? So the first two views will say no, wait. And the third view will say yes, no problem.
But it does make sense if somebody already brought something. Why shouldn't you be able to? Even according to...
Because he didn't...
He set a precedent the first time.
But he's still... But precedents... But he's... No, it's still a prohibition. You're not supposed to.
They're not asking, just do it anyway.
So do it, fine. But that question was if you're asking, what's the law? Is the law you should not, or is the law no problem? According to the first two views, the law still remains in force, no matter how many people brought the new grain. And according to the second view, once somebody did it, there's no problem whatsoever. And he spoiled it. The two breads are no longer going to be the first offering, so the whole thing doesn't apply anymore.
Last question, just bring it. That's it. The second time it happens.
I don't know if you followed what I just said. No. Okay. So we had a practical halachic ramification, a different halachic